Hello, quick video. My last video was talking about scope mounts and scope rails, the difference between Weaver and Picatinny and dovetail and 1- and 2-piece mounts. What I didn't really see on the internet or YouTube is videos discussing common scope mounting problems, the problems that most people come across most of the time, especially if you're new and you're not particularly au fait with mounting scopes. So I'm just going to run through them. So the first one is mounts that are offset, they're not matched. So if you look at these two, you can see they're not actually lining up with each other. That's because they're two different. I've actually exaggerated that. They're not actually that far off, but I've exaggerated it. So you can see that one's going off slightly to one angle. And what that does is when you mount your scope, instead of your scope being straight, if the mounts are slightly offset, your scope is going to be slightly offset to one way or to the other. So what that does for your shooting is when you're shooting, your barrel's basically pointing there, but your scope's pointing there. So when you're shooting and looking at the target on your scope, the pellets are going to be, in this case, because the scope is going to the left, your pellets are going to be to the right. And if it's way out, you might not have enough adjustment in your scope to bring the point of impact to align with the point of aim. So, and again, if that's you're having a problem getting accuracy or zeroing it, check the mounts, check that they're actually both on the rail properly and that they're a matched pair, they're not slightly misaligned. So that's that. Next thing is gaps. So what do I mean by gaps? So when you look at these two scope rings, it's these gaps here. So when you tighten down the scope, you want these gaps to be the same all round. So on this side you want them both to be the same gap, and on the other side you want them to be the same. And I do them diagonally, so I will tighten this one first, and then I will go diagonally across to the next one, and then I'll maybe do this one and then go diagonally across to that one, a bit like when you're tightening a head on an engine. So you're not just tightening one bolt first and then the others are effectively trying to catch up. The next thing is don't over tighten your scope rings. If you're trying to literally get rid of the gap, sometimes when you tighten down your scope rings, there is a gap, and that's fine as long as the scope is tight, it's not moving, it's fine that there is a gap. Just make sure the gap's equal. So don't continually tighten them down to try and get rid of the gap, because sometimes there is meant to be a gap. If you look at most scope manufacturers' websites, Hawk for instance, they do give you torque settings. I mean, I don't use torque settings. I've fitted a lot of scopes, so I sort of know how tight to do them. But I think for Hawk, for fitting the base, the scope base to the rail, it's 2.5 foot-pounds, and for tightening the ring at the top, it's less. It's 1.3 to 1.5 foot-pounds. But if you go on any scope manufacturer's website, generally they'll tell you what the torque settings are. What else do we need to look at? When you're mounting your scope, make sure that it's mounted the right way. This is your elevation turret, and this one on the side is your windage turret. The common mistake some people do is they mount the scope like that, so the windage turret is on the top. To be honest, it's not going to affect it that much, but that's the way you should be mounting them. The elevation, i.e. the up and down axis, should be on the top. The windage, i.e. the left and right axis, should be on the, when you're looking through the rifle, should be on the right. So that's that. I'm just looking at my list. Make sure your plates are not on the wrong way around. We've discussed this before. You've got your plate on the side of these mounts here, and there, when you have the plate one way round, it's for 9mm rails, and when you have it the other way around, it's for 11mm. So if you've got a 9mm rail and you've got this set to the 11mm, sometimes when you tighten it down, it won't actually tighten up because it's too big. So you have to turn this plate round to make sure it's on for the right size rail. That's that. Arrestor pins. So if I undo this one, because it's got an arrestor pin on it. Let's see if we can see that. On here we've got some holes on the top of the scope rail, and those are for arrestor pins. Which, if you look at this, see there's a little pin that sticks out. So that is meant to go into one of these holes. Now, sometimes what people do is they have the arrestor pin sticking out, and they move the scope ring past the arrestor holes, or they don't even know that these are arrestor holes, and they try and tighten down the scope mount with the arrestor pin sticking out, but it's not in a hole. So what that means is this scope mount is going to be higher, that's if you can get it to tighten up at all, than the one at the front that hasn't got. So normally the scope matching scope mount, see that one hasn't got a pin in. So make sure, if you've got an arrestor pin, either make sure it's in the hole in the rail, or if you're not going to use it, you can normally either take the arrestor pin out or just wind it in so that it's not actually protruding at the bottom of the mount. So that's another common problem. Leveling the gun. There's lots of ways to level a scope to the mount. There's three main methods. So your eyeball, the human eye is actually really good at seeing if things are straight and level or not. So when you mount your scope, look through it and see if it's level, if the vertical plane is level. So, you know, I'm trying to get this sort of reasonably straight. You don't want it to be like that. You don't want it to be like that. You want it to be pretty much straight on the vertical plane. So your eye will tell you. Also, you can use little MiniLevels. Let's just put these on here. Let's try and show you what I'm on about. So I'm going to tighten this up. So you can level the gun and then level the scope. So you can get little MiniLevels about that big, and on this gun it's actually got a flat stock. So, and it's got a flat portion here. So I can put a MiniLevel on there. I can put a MiniLevel on the side here. Right at the back here I can put MiniLevels. Now that assumes that the action is level and in a vertical plane with the stock. Again, if you look down it, generally you can see whether it's out of whack or not. But we'll assume that the action and the barrel is actually lined up level and in the same vertical plane as the stock. So that means you can level the gun. Then you put your scope in the mounts, and what you can do is, this is normally a flat surface here, or if you take this off, if it's got a scope cap, the bit underneath is normally flat. So once this is on the gun, you can put a little MiniLevel on there. MiniLevels, some people use them, some people don't. They're not fantastically accurate, but I think they're good enough for leveling most of the scopes most of the time. And if you use it in conjunction with your eyeball and you're using MiniLevels, you won't be far off. And then the third option is to use a PlumBob. So I've actually got one down the garden. What I do is, when I'm zeroing, I've set up in my garage, so I have a rifle in the rest, and it's looking down the garden, and hopefully you can see this. I've got a sort of brightly coloured paracord hanging on the wall. Yeah, there you go. So it's just sort of, try and get my finger, that's it there. It's a sort of orange coloured string, and I've got a couple of bolts tied to it, and obviously the try and get my scope zoom back in. And so when I look down my scope, the vertical plane of the reticule, the vertical line, I line it up with that PlumBob. And in fact, if I didn't have a PlumBob, that's a brick wall at the bottom of the garden, which is sort of reasonably straight. I could line it up with the bricks in the brick wall. You can use, I mean, if you've got a lamp post outside your house, you can use that. Any reasonably vertical surface, if you just look at it through the scope, and again, line up your vertical reticle and scope, and see if they match. And if you use all three of those methods, so you use your eye, you use the MiniLevels, and you use a PlumBob, you're not going to be far off. Some people swear by one method, some people use two. I tend to use all three. Whatever works for you. But generally, you're not going to be far off if you use that method. So that's another common problem. People haven't leveled their scope. So when you look through the scope, as I said, instead of it being reasonably straight, it's sort of twisted slightly, or it's twisted slightly this way, and that can introduce cant. Cant is when basically the point of impact is different from the point of aim, because either the scope is twisted, yeah, so instead of being straight, it's twisted one way or twisted the other, or because when you're shouldering the rifle, your hold of the rifle is slightly canted one side or the other, so that moves the point of impact. The point of aim to you will look the same as if you're holding the gun level. So if you're looking through the scope like that, that's pretty level. The point of impact and the point of aim should be the same. If you're canting the rifle slightly, to you it still looks through the scope as though it's on target, but that will have actually moved the pellet a little bit. Not a lot, maybe a quarter of an inch, half an inch, depending on the distance. And obviously the further out you're shooting, the more effect cant has. But that's another thing, common problem. But that's more about shooting technique rather than scope. Once you've vertically set the scope, it should be fine. If you're then canting the rifle, that's down to you not holding the rifle straight. And people do use scope levels, so little clamps that go on here with a level sticking out, so that when you're looking down the rifle, you can just have one eye on the level to see if you're actually canting the rifle. Actually, yeah, that's another good one. Let's get the camera down here. When you're mounting the scope, you see these areas here. This bit where it flares out is called a bell, and on the front you've got a similar. The front objective, you've got a bell. This flat, even bit is where you should be mounting your scope ring. So you want to mount it in the middle. You don't want it to be right up against the bell, and you don't want it to be right up against the middle here. You want it to be in the middle. Yeah, you don't want it to be touching so it can't move. You don't want it to be touching so it can't move. Get it in the middle, because when a rifle recoils, the scope is essentially being sort of forced forward or forced back, and if the scope ring is right up against the bell, it's stopping a little bit of movement, and it can actually affect your accuracy of your gun. So when you're mounting your rings, as I say, get them in the middle section of that. Yeah, you don't want it right up against one end, you don't want it right up against the other. Try and leave a little bit, even if it's a little bit of gap, even if it's just 1 millimetre, that's fine, but you don't want it to be right up against the end. You just pull it back a tiny bit, that's great. Okay, so we've talked about levelling, we've talked about MiniLevels. I have had a gun where it had such bad recoil. This was actually my Hatsan Mod 60. When I first got it, it was quite harsh, and I actually used a one-piece mount. Oh, here it is, I've got it here. Which had an arrestor pin. If you can see there, it's got the focus. There's a hole for the arrestor pin, and I had an arrestor pin in there, and I had it mounted on the rifle, and the recoil was so bad and the forces were so great that even with the arrestor pin, it actually moved the one-piece mount backwards slowly over a period of a couple of months. And I slowly noticed that the rifle was getting less and less accurate no matter what I did. And eventually I took the rail off. I don't know if you can see that. It's all scratched, all there. It's scratched. I've actually filed this down now so it's smooth, but it had actually bent over the edge of the groove that grips the scope rail. And where it had slowly moved back, it had scratched all the bottom of this, and it scratched the rail on the rifle as well. I actually sent it off to Halifax on the AGF forum, and he did a good service and fettling on it, and it doesn't break scope mounts anymore. But that's what can happen if you get scope creep. If the scope mount is not secured adequately, or if the gun has got really bad recoil, it can actually scratch and ruin. I won't really use this mount again, even though I've filed it down. It's probably not good enough to be used again. Maybe on a PCP where there's not a lot of recoil, but yeah, so that's what can happen to your scope mount if you haven't mounted it correctly. Okay, so that's about it, I think. So I hope I've covered a few common scope faults, mainly aimed at sort of new people that are not that experienced. But there you go. Yeah, I hope that was useful. Cheers. Bye.